Hello, we are Håkon and Hanne from Norway. Welcome to our presentation. The presentation is about the story of magic, the magic that helps storyliners of all ages to promote personal understanding and growth. This is the magic of creativity. The creative possibilities and constraints of storyline as a sustainable and resilient tool, or more precisely, as a pedagogical approach, named creativity. The ability to create is just what we, people and planet, need to be resilient and to sustain life. This is what we call the wisdom of Mother Earth, transferred to humanity as deep ecological literacy, or ecoliteracy for short. With this statement in mind, we'll dive into part one of this presentation. The concept creative ecoliteracy will be explored by a story from the past, a storyline named Tree of Life. The reason to share an old storyline will hopefully be revealed as I tell the story. The Tree of Life project was inspired by the ethics and values of Earth Charter, and by these words of wisdom. The best we can give our children is roots and wings. Our Tree of Life is rooted in the ecosophy of Arne Næss, who argued for cultivating the creative wings of the eco-self. To organize the cultivation between roots and wings, we need the ecosystemic and creative flow of didactic relational thinking, as developed by Bjørndal and Wiberg in the 1970s. The theoretical mapping of the project emerged as a model, highlighting the statement that life is more than the sum of its parts, or simply 1 + 1 is 3, the principle of creativity. The map helped us navigate through the landscape of learning in first grade Ørn Primary School, spring 2005. By us, I mean the partnership of grown-ups and children. As an action research project, the aim was to explore and promote creative ecoliteracy and to highlight the essentials of storyline, focusing on how to sustain life and foster resilience. In short, our approach can be summarized as eco-story playing, visualized as a tree with roots and wings in a holistic, self-centered view of life. Like in living organism, the story emerged through creative, art-based play driven forward by surprising happenings and challenging missions to fulfill. The tree, symbolizing Mother Earth as a community of nature, beings, and culture, was crafted collectively by children and teacher team. The tree habitants, the earthlings, symbolizing the human and non-human living beings of the planet, were created individually by the children themselves. The tree and the life, symbolizing the planetary ecological flow of energy and matter, was played as a magical make-believe story, emerging in the creative tension span between order and chaos, facts and fiction. So that is how this storyline came to reflect the vital process of life mastery, the ecological self-organization that evolves in the creative literacy flow between socialization and personalization. As the storyline emerged, the tree came alive, like a playground for eco-centered living, learning, and loving. And here it is, an ecological community of life with roots and wings, housing the 20 earthlings in their private homes, ready to sustain life and be resilient, inviting their human friends inside to play their way towards life competence. For creativity to evolve, we had to stay focused on the mindfulness of here and now. By doing this, the storyline essentials emerged. the story, the key questions, and the didactic reflection. The story dimension was crucial, following the three well-known phases: once upon a time, then one day, and happily ever after. In this setting, the teaching team took an active part, playing our way through the drama in partnership with the children. Of course, the plot and its turning point were the most outstanding happenings to us all, never to be forgotten. True to the storyline ID, the driving focus and force in the process was the key questions, stored in the yellow box named the wondering box by the children. As we, the teaching team, had never crafted such a tree, the questions and the exploring were real challenges. Sometimes the obstacles, ponderings, and doubts were overwhelming. However, together we solved the problems, quite often with the children as coaches. And of course, there were a lot of learning going on, nicely linked to the national curriculum of 1997. Not by following detailed pre-designed lesson plans, but by the ongoing reflections based on the 5 fundamental interconnected questions of learning, continually synchronized to the story playing process. The key questions being asked before, along the way, and after the line of sessions. From this web of didactic relational thinking, we designed and stored our storyline like a written web of documented planning, processing, and evaluation. And as you can see, one of the earthlings, Dragon, is aware of the need to sustain himself by taking care of his hunger for new wisdom. So let's follow Dragon to learn more about Tree of Life. Dragon, once an earthling in Tree of Life, is still alive. He's sitting next to me in this very moment. And he's now looking forward for me to open his photo book. Dragon was born in Tree of Life as one of the 20 earthlings who, one by one, were presented to the class. First, he was designed in Play-Doh, just the way his human creator Håkon wanted. Then he was drawn to give the creator a pattern for the next step, crafting in soft material, as you can see, with a huge amount of concentration, motivation, and compassion. The teacher role in the process of creation was a technical and moral assistant, helping only at request. Dragon was just as eco-friendly and creative as any young earthling can be. He took actively part in the tree like the other earthlings, trying his best to co-create a sustainable and resilient community of life. Like singing in the earthly choir of heart, head, hand, body, social, mind, nature, culture, beings. It was as if Dragon and Tree was one breathing organism. Oh, input, processing, output, and feedback. Always dancing between the interpersonal and the intrapersonal sides of life. So by singing, dancing, and playing his way in the tension span between order and chaos, he evolved as a healthy, creative eco-self, as a true dragon. Through the small and large challenges of everyday life, Dragon bravely moved forward in the long line of life stories, from once upon a time to then one day, and into happily ever after of today and tomorrow. The image of storyline as a long line of 1 + 1 = 3 magic makes us remember the vital force of the story, stories of the past, present, and future. I have reason to believe that our story, Tree of Life, has proved to be sustainable and resilient, both as a storyline approach and as a life experience for teachers and pupils alike. Today, the pupils are 24 years old, and one of them, Håkon, the creator of Dragon and still a fan of Storyline, is the next presenter.
Welcome to my part of the presentation. I want to show you a kind of storyline that I believe could strengthen its capacity for learning opportunities. I will do this by telling you how rules of magic establishes boundaries that concentrates creativity, and I will highlight how this plays directly into the vision for a more sustainable and resilient storyline. So how do I know about this stuff? Well, my mother has talked about it a lot. Growing up with 2 pedagogues for parents has taught me a great deal about using stories for learning, and as you already have seen, my mother even brought Storyline into my own classroom. Storyline has gradually become more important to me, and especially so when I wrote my bachelor thesis about establishing interdisciplinarity as its own educational field of study. To me, there are 3 ways of thinking that could help achieve this. This is systems thinking, design thinking, and story thinking, which is the term I use to describe all the different ways that stories are used to do problem solving, learning, and bringing people together. I'm quite fond of Storyline, but I'm also worried that it does not always achieve its true potential, that it becomes too easy, too much anything goes, if it is used as just a fun way to learn. If so, it certainly cannot teach all there is to say about resilience, as that would imply strong characteristics of rational and emotional endurance. And when it comes to sustainability, blending social or environmental movements in education is quite possible, but painting a moral picture does not necessarily lead to pragmatic decision-making. Although I have a suggestion that is not necessarily feasible, but I want you to be mindful of what I'm about to present. Simply put, I would like to use rules to concentrate creativity and pave a path for magic. When I say rules, I mean the fundamental boundaries that surrounds some sort of activity. In football, you are not allowed to pick up the ball with your hands. In society, stealing is forbidden by law. Even nature has its own restrictions, as gravity sadly makes it impossible to levitate at will. When I say magic, I mean the feeling of wonder and curiosity when stories facilitate opportunities for learning. My hope is that this storyline teaches a kind of tacit knowledge through transformative learning of how thinking in narratives could help one make one more prepared to maneuver the rules, boundaries, and restrictions that sometimes make life more complicated. To make you see how, I will present some examples. The first example is Peter Jackson's speech to his film crew. He was of course the director of the Lord of the Rings movies, and as the director, it was ultimately his vision for the finished movie that determined the filmmaking process. When telling about how the movies were made in the DVD extras, he said, "I didn't want fantasy Hollywood movie design. I wanted something authentic. I gave a little speech to the design crew very early on. It was a little weird, but it was the only way I could express myself. I said, look, we've been given the opportunity to make the Lord of the Rings, but from this point on, I want to think that Lord of the Rings is real, that it's history, that these events happened. I want us to imagine that we've been lucky enough to be able to go on location and shoot our movie where the real events happened. Those characters existed, and I want that our costumes are accurate to what the real people wore. Hobbiton still exists. It's overgrown with weeds, run down and neglected for the last 300 to 400 years, but we are going to go back there and clean it up. We're the luckiest film crew in the world." That was effectively my speech to try to get everybody's heads into what I wanted in terms of feeling of reality. This speech stretched out to everyone involved in the movie making, like the costume department, weapon crafters, and set designers, and it really made a difference, as the amount of detail, heart, and effort that was put into everything you see on screen is what made the movies so special. His speech did some important things. it made stories real. He had a clear idea of how he wanted to make the movie and how it was supposed to look like to honor Tolkien's work. But how do you make other people understand your vision? Well, have you ever worked with other people and noticed that it's way more difficult to express your ideas out loud than in your own head? Well, then one must create a motivational direction that unifies the thoughts of others towards one objective. Each have their own paths, but they all strive for the same purpose. Learn from Peter Jackson and strive for that one idea that unifies and inspires. My next example is this weird book called Top 10 Games You Can Play in Your Head by Yourself. It is a republished collection of a series of books written between 88 and 93 and were originally written by a man going under the peculiar pen name J. Theophrastus Bartholomew. But his real identity is actually unknown. His books does, however, contain this picture of him. This re-edited version contains some of his best games, which is not the television or computer kind, but written games that are supposed to spark the mind into creating stories. Each game starts with some essential guidelines and inspiration, but after that, they simply say go, telling the reader to put down the book, close their eyes, and experience a story in their heads. If doing it with the right mindset, it's almost like dreaming, and maybe it teaches you some valuable lesson. I will quickly use my favorite game, Dungeons, as an example. It starts with a short story that is meant to give us some context of what dungeons are. This introduction contains characters, challenges, and motifs that the reader will find more or less familiar based on what they already know of dungeons. The game is testing our dungeon knowledge. Then the game explains its purpose, what is expected of the reader, and why it should be played, and shows what a dungeon could look like. The game is now outlining the activity and provides some initial associations about dungeons. It then continues the story on the first page, but suddenly stops when the main character realizes something unexpected that makes her doubt whether she really knows anything about dungeons at all. The game even starts to challenge the reader, asking, what is a dungeon? Making us say the word over and over again until it loses all meaning. Now, the game is welcoming us to the terrifying and wondrous state of uncertainty, to grab onto our curiosity. Although the game describes some different expressions of dungeons on the next 2 pages and reassures us of what certainly isn't a dungeon, it thus rebuilds and solidifies our dungeon knowledge. Then the game asks us to create our own character, but within the frame of 4 different character types. The game makes the character creation even more interesting when it asks us a series of questions to establish what kind of relationship there is between our character and dungeons. Now that we have a character with at least some connection to dungeons, the game wants to introduce our opposition. Throughout the book's games, it wants us to create a shadow self, a copy of ourselves that makes one's journey more difficult. If the reader is quite satisfied with their character, then the shadow self has to be a worthy opponent. The game can't be too easy, so it sparks a conflict against our worst enemy, ourselves. Then the game wants us to craft an experience, which is important to determine the kind of feeling the dungeon is supposed to give. Then the game wants us to choose a scenario within the frame of some ground rules and core challenges, with a nudge of inspiration. But then it says, did you choose? Are you ready? And simply with some final words and wishes of good luck, the game says, go. Summarized, the game of Dungeons is structured like this. It tests our dungeon knowledge, outlines the activity, introduces uncertainty to facilitate curiosity, rebuilds and solidifies our knowledge, creating a character and establishing a relationship, sparks some conflict, craft a dungeon experience and dungeon scenario, go. I've created a silly but important equation to concentrate this structure even further, which reads that excitement and challenge multiplied by uncertainty and curiosity, creates opportunities for learning, all through something as simple but genius as a game for the mind. The next and last example is the most important one of them all. Brandon Sanderson is a fantasy writer that is known for putting a lot of emphasis on world building and magic systems, which is the set of rules that define how magic works. Magic is obviously not real, but that does not mean that it can't or shouldn't adhere to some underlying principles when used for story purposes. There are, for example, a lot of rules in Harry Potter when it comes to wands and spells. Superheroes also follow rules in the sense that their powers do specific things and it's often restricted by limitations or weaknesses. These rules are, however, not always structured in the same way. At the convention panel about how magic works, Sanderson said, well, obviously, magic has to have rules. His statement was met with high levels of criticism, as the other panelists argued how rules demystifies the wondrous feeling that magic should spark. This led Sanderson to theorize how the implementation of rules creates a more satisfying story as a whole. He eventually divided magic systems into two categories, soft and hard. Soft magic is used to establish a sense of wonder and give the story a fantastical feel. Even the characters might not truly know what it can do. By holding back the rules, the author makes us feel that the world is vast and mysterious. But the good writers of soft systems rarely use their magic to solve problems. Rather, it creates them. Then people must solve them. If the characters try to use the magic that they don't understand, it shouldn't do what they expect it to, as the reader doesn't know what to expect either. Hard magic is when the author explicitly describes the rules of magic. Then the reader can have fun, feeling like they are a part of it, and the author can show clever twists in the way it works. If the reader understands how the magic works, like understanding chess, one has been given the repertoire to solve magical challenges in their own heads, by themselves. Then it's not the magic that mystically makes everything better, but it's the character's wit and experience that finds a solution. Most writers lie somewhere in between these two, and it's certainly possible to use both. But do not create a system that ends up doing the opposite of what you want. There is not one that is better than the other. They do different things, but choosing which to use and doing it consistently is crucial to determine what kind of experience you want the audience to have. If you want the benefits of a soft system, ask yourself, how can they solve this without magic? Or even better, how can using the magic to try to solve the problem really just make things worse? If you want the benefits of a hard system, ask yourself, how could the characters use what they already have and know to solve this conflict? Over the course of several years, Sanderson created 3 laws for writing consistent and satisfying magic systems that makes something as abstract and fictional as magic adhere to a precise order of consequences. Sanderson says that even though he has named them laws, they are simply writing techniques that has worked for him. If you understood the distinction between soft and hard systems, then you probably also understand the first rule, which says that conflict should be solved directly proportional with the reader's understanding of said magic. The second rule says that weaknesses, costs, and limitations of abilities are more important than the abilities themselves. This causes struggle and tension, as it will require the characters to work even harder to succeed, which makes the writing more interesting, the characters more clever, and the solutions more satisfying. Limitation forces you as a writer to create more depth to your world and characters. Weaknesses could be things that enemies can exploit. Costs could be limited magical resources or dangerous side effects of magic use. This is the kind of rules that encourage innovation. The third rule says that one should expand on what is already a part of the system before adding something new. The third rule is crucial for good storytelling, and it's a constant balancing act. A thoughtful writer changes one or two things about what we know, then extrapolates purposefully through all of the ramifications of that change. Your job as a writer is to look how the changes you've made will affect your world and answer what happens when questions. Showing how every faction, race, or religion in your book affects one another will create a much stronger story as a whole. If your story needs something new and exciting, try instead to expand on what you already have. A good magic system has relatively few powers that the author has considered in depth. Instead of giving every character a new power, can you have different takes on the same power, but used in different ways? Thus, the purpose of this third law is to create a well-balanced story with a tight narrative. These rules have been directed primarily towards writers, but do you already see their importance when it comes to storyline? What would you think if I were to replace every mentioned instance of writer and magic with teacher and learning? What would you think if I were to change Sanderson's controversial statement and say that, well, obviously, learning has to have rules? What's important to learn from this is that rules does not necessarily mean to reduce the amount of freedom. They are meant to concentrate creativity, promote focus, and pave a way forth. They create an order of behavior where experience and competence becomes of the highest importance, and maneuvering them are interesting challenges to solve, like a game for the mind, and consistency is key. The explanation and significance of these examples can be highlighted by the terms rule and magic in the following way. Peter Jackson's rule was to pretend it's real, which adjusted his crew into the right mindset. Bartholomew's book wanted us to create our own story, but within the rules of his game, which sought to inspire and nudge you into discovery. Sanderson suggests that one should follow his laws consistently, as they encourages satisfying systems for storytelling. To me, these three are exceptional examples of my wish to use rules to concentrate creativity and pave a path for magic. And when done correctly, it's the relationship between these two that directs towards opportunities for learning. And now I have some suggestions to the teacher who feels inspired by the laws of magic and wants to use them for storyline. Considering the first rule, ask yourself, what kind of feeling do you want to establish in the classroom? What does the children need to understand right now? What do the children already know about the topic at hand? How do you know that every child is following your class? And the second rule, ask yourself, how do you want the children to face their weaknesses? How do you promote creativity within predetermined boundaries? How can children experience the significance of costs and limitations? How do you make children take responsibility and do it themselves? And the third rule, ask yourself, how do you make children think in terms of cause and effect? How can children learn to improve something they have created? How can children learn how they affect other people? How do you make children consider the bigger picture? In the interest of storyline, remember, it's not a method that learns for you. Rather, children should be given the mindset to take responsibility for their own learning. This is a distinction between what we can understand as soft and hard storyline. But remember that the one does not rank over the other, but be consistent in how you want to use them. In the interest of pedagogy, remember that excitement and challenge multiplied by uncertainty and curiosity creates opportunities for learning, as this is crucial to how one motivates children to learn. In the interest of sustainability, consider that creating a more sustainable world is not easy. Rather, it's a difficult challenge which relies on a large amount of important prerequisites. And for resilience, consider that children need to learn how to meet these challenges head on. To do this effectively, one needs a kind of tacit knowledge that tells one how to maneuver the difficulties of life. Thank you for listening to our presentation.